Hello, I hope all is well. Today I'd like to talk with you about gays, lesbians, and homophobia, chapter 12 of Clinard and Meyer's book. And as I was considering this material, I thought about how this relates to some of the themes we've been discussing all semester long, including themes like how identity works, how does labeling affect people, and the way in which they're judged, and also, too, how do people identify themselves in relation to their behavior, thoughts, emotions? Because sociologists are interested in measuring not only social groups, but how those groups define themselves. And so this, I think, is interesting information corresponding with a lot of other things we've looked at this term. By the way, I should mention that the term homosexuality is somewhat of a medicalized term that within the gay community, probably not the preferred term. Gay is more preferred today. So one of the things you can ask yourself is, again, about a label and who's applying the label, and what kind of relationships of power are involved in that. Anyway, to start with, your text defines homosexuality as a general orientation for sex with other members of one's own gender, and I would say probably one's own sex is more accurate. This can be male with male relationships, your text refers to as gay. Female with female relationships, your text refers to as lesbian. Those are the terms that were used in the past, and I would argue a lot of lesbians today also refer to themselves as just simply gay. So the terms themselves are changing over time, and their meanings are in flux. Homosexual behavior generally extends beyond just sexual activities and tends to also include companionship and affection. And so, again, what is the basis upon which identity is determined, either by the people in the identity or the people who are labeling others as having the identity? Where does this medical term come from? According to your text, it became popular in 1869. A fellow defined it as a failure to achieve normal erection during contact with a member of the opposite sex. However, this definition was rejected by professional literature because it excludes alternative criteria, such as, for example, love, and the term for this is homophilic, and attraction, homogenic. And so this question is about what is homosexuality or being gay related to in terms of physical entities, attraction, and it could also be the idea of love. So these are not easy things to define. Also, I should mention a couple things before moving on. Your text mentions transgender people, which is a gender identity typically different from that usually assigned to them at birth. It doesn't mention much about transsexual. Transsexual would be somebody who undergoes a surgery or other biological modifications so that their sex is changed. And that's something in your text too, as well as bisexual, the idea of people who are interacting sexually with members of either sex. A quick question for you. A well-known study of sexuality in the United States by Kinsey and other researchers found that 37% of men experience homosexual contact sometime in their lives, but only 4% remain exclusively homosexual. This is true. And by the way, Kinsey is one of the major researchers of the last century related to sexuality. There's this notion of true identity, and your text mentions that a sociologist identifies a true homosexual as any adult who regards him or herself as homosexual or gay, and who willingly acknowledges the label before another person. Identity can be something which a person internalizes and then is willing to state to other people. When we think about homosexuality as deviant behavior, I want to be careful because I think that this is something that can be seen as a very negative label that is being applied in a contemporary way toward individuals in particular category. However, I think it's really important not to ignore. I have a very deep ingrained history of oppression of homosexuals, and also laws that have criminalized some of these behaviors. To acknowledge the way in which this was constructed at one point as deviant. We've come to accept same-sex marriage now in the United States, but it's also important to recognize that this is a very, very big change from the past. So when I discuss this as deviant, this is the root of where these ideas come from. And historically, attitudes toward gay people have varied. The example given in the Greek and Roman times, it says people certainly practiced homosexuality in those times and may have even approved of it in some circumstances. And actually, in Greek and Hebrew culture, they didn't have any real term for homosexuality. So you can't see something if you don't name it. Society labels homosexuality as deviant by initiating and reinforcing sexual norms. And so that's another way you can think about it, is that some people, primarily maybe religious people, may, and there are many different types of religious people, but may have very strong feelings about homosexuality, and therefore this propensity toward thinking of it as deviant. Lastly, homosexual behavior is not inherently deviant. There's nothing about it that is wrong or right, for that matter. It becomes so as a result of purposive social processes. In fact, you can look at the animal kingdom and you'd realize that there are a great number of animals who at times engage in homosexual activity. So, some things to keep in mind. Two things to consider. As just mentioned, critics of homosexual behaviors are mainly advocating religious prohibitions and religion's prohibitions against the behavior. They might refer to particular religious texts or scripture to make their case against homosexuality. And a second issue, such behavior deviates from normal family situations by distorting general sex roles in society. So it's important to note that traditional sex roles are also very historically ingrained. And again, that's not to say they can't change. However, these as a basis for understanding how a family is supposed to operate and the positions, the statuses in the family. Sometimes people will be against gays by virtue of the fact that, as it says, it distorts what are considered the appropriate sex roles. Individuals with homosexual orientations frequently become targets for social stigma and rejection by members of society. This can vary a great deal. There are some people who are more accepting, but it is also noteworthy to think about the degree of anger and hatred that may be expressed against gay people. It's very important to remember that that exists. Homophobia is what that is called, a fear and dislike of lesbians and gay men, and includes avoidance of anything associated with homosexuality. Some people link the origins of homophobia, again, to religious doctrine, linked to homosexuality, and also to theories of psychological maladjustment. One thing that is useful to consider is that in the early 70s, the American Psychological Association had their book called the DSM, and it's the Diagnostics and Statistics Manual, which laid out mental disorders. And one of them they found at the time, they labeled homosexuality a mental disorder. So that has eventually been dropped from there, but still people make this association, as well as it says the association between strong Christian beliefs and an intolerance of homosexuality, previously noted. Others argue the rejection of homosexuality was an important unifying figure, or feature, I should say, of the Christian community at a time when there was struggle within the group. So one of the things you can note is that group identity can be formed around opposition to something, and that may be the source of this Christian community's identifying feature at the time. Religious scriptures may condemn some sexual behaviors, but not all, so it's important to think about those texts, but also to see how there might be paradoxes within religious tenets and books. When considering homosexuality, you can also, of course, consider homophobia. And studies on homophobia have examined things like religious background, strength of religious identification, and political conservatism as important for understanding perhaps the degree of homophobia someone might have. It may be very well related to those three elements as discussed. There is a couple of bits in your textbook. Many homophobic people have little difficulty identifying and expressing their attitudes. These feelings generally emphasize clear awareness and strong feelings. So it's, I think, important to recognize a history of homophobia and discrimination against gay people when you consider the idea of this as deviant. There's another factor, though, to consider on your slide. Homosociality, defined as the social preference, but not necessarily an erotic attraction for one's own sex, members of one's own sex. Few gay people view themselves as deviant. However, stigmatization from members of society, from those around this person, may result in negative effects for homosexuals. And these can include three things at least. Feeling guilt over their behaviors, having fear of negative sanctions for being gay from family members, friends, employers, and that can lead to feelings of rejection and isolation. It also says gay people have been subject to severe legal discrimination because of their sexual orientation. It's illegal in some countries, for example, Uganda, and it talks about how in 2014, the leader signed into law a bill that would increase the penalties for gay people even more. In some instances, included life in prison, which some said was better than the original bill, which was imposing the death penalty. Speaking of this, a question. Laws forbidding homosexual behavior began with what of the possible sex codes listed below? The answer is Jewish sex codes, as stated in this slide. These codes were then formalized by Christian laws that governed Europe. So this is the basis for some of the legal prohibitions against homosexuality. It says the provisions later formed the basis for English common law. Then the slide also says in the 19th century, reforms reduced the maximum penalty to life imprisonment. And more recently, 2003, in the United States, we have had Lawrence versus Texas, a Supreme Court decision, a very important Supreme Court decision, because it basically said that laws against sodomy, state-based laws, were unconstitutional. And so, with one fell swoop, the Supreme Court struck down all the anti-sodomy statutes in the United States. However, there are still states that apply criminal sanctions to public homosexual acts. So in Lawrence versus Texas, the idea was those acts in private are perfectly legal. If we're considering the prevalence of homosexuality, it's something that might be hard to find out. Researchers, it says, have inadequate data when estimating the incidence, prevalence, and increases or decreases of homosexuality. So how do you measure homosexuality? How do you measure how much there is in a society and whether it's increasing or decreasing? You could also consider two variations of homosexuality. There are variations in many social and behavioral characteristics of homosexuality, as we've talked about. A couple things too: short-term relationships versus long-term relationships. Are these meetings which are brief and just basically for the purpose of immediate gratification? Are these longer-term relationship-based actions and identities, and how those might also play into how someone considers themselves either gay or not? In regard to sexual development, the biological perspective asserts that the difference between homosexual orientation and heterosexual behaviors may be linked to brain structures. Would you say true or false? The biological perspective does actually assert that these may be linked to brain structures. There's also been some research about how birth order effects can perhaps affect whether or not someone is gay. One thing they've found in studies is that women who have many male children, the last male child has a greater likelihood of being gay because of some changes in the woman's biology through the process of having had children. If you're looking at sex role socialization and becoming a homosexual, you can consider the biological perspective. There have been studies on, as mentioned in the previous slide, physical brain anatomy, and there's been interesting research on DNA, though not conclusive at all. So that's the next part. Studies conducted on the biological perspective have had preliminary and limited findings. I mentioned that study about birth order effects in the previous slide. Sociological perspectives. You can consider sexuality as socially constructed, and it's learned through interactions with others. Some people talk about, for example, situational homosexuality, which would be, for example, people who are same-sex segregated, either through the military or through prison or correctional institutions, and there may be homosexual activity in those environments that then ends once those environments are left. So there's a question about how sexuality is constructed over what period of time, and how much people say, yes, this is me. Socialization also takes place within the context of sex roles. Sex roles are sometimes called gender roles. These are collections of norms that define socially accepted male and female behavior, and they're rooted in tradition. The thing about sex roles, gender roles, is that you cannot ignore tradition in the formation of these. They pre-exist your entry onto the scene. And that said, they are also amenable to change. Continuing on sociological perspectives, sexual behavior is always embedded in a web of normative constraints that set limits on acceptable objects and people. So sexuality is constrained, and religion has a great deal to do with that, and it's limited also in terms of acceptable expression. Normative constraints. The sexual socialization process sometimes works imperfectly. Some individuals come to derive sexual satisfaction from objects and people outside their group's normative structures. So the sexual socialization process, it says, sometimes works imperfectly. You could also say that it varies from person to person. We don't all encounter the same socialization process as we go through childhood, adolescence, early adulthood, and then later adulthood. So to say it's imperfect would imply there would be some kind of perfect socialization process, and that simply doesn't exist. I would say there are some which are considered more or less deviant, but the idea of sexual socialization is it's always processual, and it always involves difference. Becoming a homosexual. Individuals develop their own sexual orientations by learning certain practices, or alternatively, by not learning to favor other alternatives. It's a little bit of a clunky sentence I've written there. The idea is that it's a learned behavior like anything, and sexual orientation is not hard and fast one way. It develops, it's progressive, it may go through staged development with many different possible outcomes or identities at any given point. Individuals learn concepts of masculinity and femininity as part of sex role socialization. And that's another thing to keep in mind, are stereotypes related to homosexuality, that gay men would somehow likely be more effeminate, for example, or that gay women would be somehow more masculine. These stereotypes do not hold. They are things that you could see, perhaps, but you can't use blanket generalizations like that to understand gay culture. On becoming a homosexual, we can look at an explanation of the emergence of homosexuality and heterosexuality invoking three concepts. The first, sex role adoption. That refers to the active choices to adopt behavior patterns that are characteristic of one sex or the other. Sex role or gender role nonconformity could be a part of that. Sex role preference describes the desire to adopt behaviors associated with one sex or the other, or perception of this behavior as preferable to alternatives. And then finally, you could talk about sex role identification, a crucial process in developing homosexuality. It indicates the actual incorporation of a given sex role and the unthinking reactions characteristic of it. Under developing a homosexual identity, the acquisition of a gay identity is a subtle and private process, and it occurs at different times for different people. There's a discussion in your text about primary homosexual behaviors, and it says that, as I've mentioned before, these might result from involvement in a particular situation, like single-sex communities, such as prison, military posts, boarding schools. And the idea here is these people and others who commit homosexual acts are not homosexual in the full sociological sense, in terms of claiming an identity. Secondary homosexual behaviors, though, are tending to seek sexual gratification predominantly and continually with members of the same sex. And these acts represent expressions of homosexual self-concepts and roles. Let's now consider the coming out process, the process by which someone publicly declares their homosexual identity. It says in the slide, declaration of a deviant homosexual identity. I don't think many people who are coming out declare themselves as deviant. That's phrasing from 1971 that is 50 years old now, so it's more just the process of coming out. And they use that action to convey that identity, he said, to heterosexuals, to straight people. It involves several elements: recognition of one's sexual preferences, experiences with others in sex role socialization, a process of realizing that these elements form part of a sexual identity, and then these resulting behavioral commitments to a homosexual lifestyle are the result of the previous three parts. These stages in coming out are discussed here, and they have four. I'll go through each briefly. Sensitization. The individual begins to become aware of differences from others of the same sex. So, by high school, the individual has developed a distinct sense of contrast with other people. It's kind of a lack of understanding of those feelings. Identity confusion stage represents a separation of behavior from the person's sexual feelings and the recognition of an individual's sexual orientation. So it says a boy may experience sexual attraction for other males, but either fail to act upon these feelings or try to deny them. Third, identity assumption brings important events such as defining oneself as homosexual and acknowledging a shared identity with other homosexuals. It says individuals may have some contact with homosexual subcultures like gay bars at that stage. In the final stage, commitment, the individual takes on homosexuality as a way of life. Homosexual subcultures represent collections of norms and values. people who form a distinct subculture. That subculture creates conditions that permit or condone homosexuality. Members come to learn these norms as part of the coming out process, and exposure continues in social situations that involve other gay people. So it's this ongoing culture that supports people having this identity. The development of a homosexual community seems to depend on society's level of intolerance and the desire to weaken the stigma imposed by the outside society. So it's a two-way street, if you will. The degree to which there's intolerance might help create the subculture, but also the subculture wants to weaken those kinds of norms against their behavior and the stigmas associated with those behaviors. Sexual socialization and becoming gay. Homosexual subcultures facilitate this, and Miller asserted certain characteristics define conditions for the development of homosexual or gay communities. 1. Some personal freedom and social tolerance. 2. Economic independence and social mobility. 3. Relatively high status for women. And 4. Declining power of the family and religion in determining aspects of an individual's life. So here's an example of how you might apply this. Argentina. The high cost of living prevents many young people from living openly homosexual lives. They must remain in their parents' homes, leaving them little personal freedom. So you could take these four and consider them in terms of the ability to develop that lifestyle, whether they might promote or inhibit that. Let's try a review question. The term lesbianism comes from the name of, if you've been reading, you'll know it's B, the Greek island of Lesbos. And the second bullet point there, sub-bullet point, the Greek poetess Sappho led a group of women in a network of homosexual relationships and behavior. So this is the origin of that term. What is the nature of lesbianism? Like male homosexuals, lesbians encounter public stigma and social rejection. Laws, though, do not specifically prohibit sexual acts between women, and few jurisdictions ever even try to apply other laws that may result in sanctions. So the stigmatization is greater for gay males than for gay females. Lesbians also exhibit fewer identifiable characteristics that male homosexuals show, so they usually become targets for adverse public opinion only when they actively proclaim a sexual identity. Societal gender roles are also learned, as we've discussed, through social interactions. And on that note, women can drift casually into homosexuality, and they can do it more than men do by starting with vague romantic attachments. Again, leading to the question, well, is this a full-on identity? Is this more exploring? What could this be determined as being? Under becoming a lesbian, most lesbians first recognize homosexual feelings in late adolescence or in early adulthood. The average male homosexual tends to experience less stable relationships than gay women, and gay women tend to pursue selective involvements. So there may be a greater frequency with some gay men for shorter term, less stable relationships, whereas women perhaps more toward selective involvements and longer term and more stable relationships. Lesbian self-concept, women tend to emphasize emotional rather than physical aspects of mutual attractions. As some people would say, it's about the person. The self-labeling process occurs through friendships, which provide a crucial condition for the development of a lesbian identity. So the friendships allow for the development of an identity. Also, it's worth noting stereotypes about masculinity and femininity within gay culture. It says, some have long thought that lesbianism combines elements of both masculinity and femininity. Such stereotypes form the basis for many people's conception of lesbians. They imagine a lesbian as masculine-looking, acting, and thinking. The phrase butch is how that's embodied. In any pair of lesbians in a couple, social expectations often cast one as feminine and the other as masculine. In reality, some lesbians may fit such stereotypes, but others don't. So this is important, that stereotypes may pollute or cloud, I should say, other people's understanding of lesbianism and the relationships it involves. Homosexual subcultures act as functional networks organized to give support and context for social relationships. In other words, you get support systems that develop around you if you intend on pursuing an identity, and that's important and necessary, especially when your identity is stigmatized. Lesbians, though it should be said, do not immerse themselves in the homosexual world in gay culture perhaps as much as males do. There are behavioral patterns of lesbians that prove less socially alienating, again as mentioned in a previous slide. Also, lesbians are better able, quite frequently, to mask their sexual orientation. There's just not as much focus on gay women as opposed to gay men as a stigmatized identity in U.S. society. Therefore, although lesbians are less likely to be in need of subcultural support, they still experience stigma and issues of homophobia and social rejection. That may be rejection from parents or friends, other family members, because of the coming out process. The gay liberation movement has encouraged gay males to proclaim and defend their human rights, which overshadowed similar efforts by lesbians. So gay males were more visible and advocates for civil rights. As a consequence, lesbians have turned to homosexual subculture to receive certain benefits. In other words, lesbians joining forces with gay men. Transvestitism, a bit of a tongue twister. The definition of this: a transvestite is someone, either a man or a woman, who dresses in clothing considered appropriate for the other gender for reasons that include sexual gratification. In other words, not doing it for the money or for entertainment or other reasons. It's about sexual satisfaction and gratification. Today, transvestitism is often referred to as cross-dressing. That's the more popular term now, the more accepted term. And many people regard transvestitism as deviant behavior because it promotes essentially antisocial activities. So the extent of this as a deviant identity, it depends on who is looking at it and how it's being judged and the context in which it's occurring. Most women who cross-dress today do so for reasons of fashion rather than to gain public acceptance as male or men. And as a result, women who gain sexual satisfaction from cross-dressing may do it without a stigma attached. Male cross-dressers today tend more to maintain secrecy and privacy, although many male transvestites are married men. And there are also two subcultures which promote cross-dressing and various supporting identities within that, such as shows, drag queen shows that may be held on a regular basis, or other functions to allow people to express the identity. AIDS is also something to be considered along with homosexuality, and AIDS is an acronym standing for Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome. The number of individuals worldwide with AIDS in 2008 estimated to be around 33 million. That's from the World Health Organization. All of these people have been infected with the human immunodeficiency virus, or HIV. More than 2.1 million people died of AIDS-related illnesses in 2007. Now, you may have heard that today HIV can be controlled through drugs, and this is true, but I would make a strong argument that these are drugs that are available primarily to well-off people in Western societies. AIDS still ravages many communities in Africa, for example, and also in Asia, among other places. Disease and transmission. The focus initially was on a particular behavior as leading to a disease. In 1981, a disease that was known as gay-related immunodeficiency took the lives of 121 people. So the original focus was, what's the behavior? Oh, it must be homosexual behavior that's causing this disease. The following year, HIV was isolated after another 447 people had died from AIDS. And then eventually what happened was the categories emerged of risk groups. So for example, not just gay people, but also heroin users, intravenous drug users, prostitutes, people from certain countries too, like Haitians, were disproportionately represented among AIDS victims. So this idea of it being related to a particular identity proved to be false. It was about a mode of transmission. Symptoms of AIDS may show up years after initial exposure to the virus, and some people may be asymptomatic. I've taken this from another source from the World Wide Web, but this is the diagnosis of HIV infection among adults and adolescents by transmission category that we were talking a little bit about before, and this is from 2010 from the Centers for Disease Control. You can see that male-to-male sexual contact is an important source of HIV infection. It's the dominant source. In injection drug use is a smaller percentage. It's declined. Male-to-male sexual contact and injection drug use, a small percentage, but the second biggest category source for HIV infection is heterosexual contact today. The impact of AIDS. At first, many remained unaware of this problem or classified it as a problem with certain groups or within certain groups. So again, the stigma applied to certain groups of people as opposed to understanding the actual etiology of the disorder, the disease. However, societal concern started to emerge after having celebrities come forward who had contracted the disease. Some of these were very well-known people at the time. Rock Hudson, an actor, many different movies. Perry Ellis, of course, the fashion designer, and Irving Magic Johnson, an NBA player who's later gone on to own his own NBA franchise and has been involved in many businesses. In the early days of the outbreak, AIDS maintained a reputation as a local problem, so it was seen as regional to gay centers like New York and San Francisco, for example, and one largely confined to deviant groups, and that it didn't really have much effect on the larger society. However, as you now have seen in that previous slide, nearly 30% of people who contract HIV now are straight. A 1987 Gallup poll accessing public opinion indicated widespread public awareness of AIDS as a problem after the death of celebrities like Rock Hudson and the HIV positive status of Magic Johnson. It became something that could infect anyone. Lastly, we can talk about social change. There have been some important recent changes concerning homosexuality, one of which is the legalization of same-sex marriage today. In 2015, the Supreme Court struck down all state bans on same-sex marriage. And that meant it was legalized in all 50 states, and states were required to honor out-of-state same-sex marriage licenses. So this is a watershed moment, moving from such incredible stigma, including the possibility of dying because of an identity that you have, to the acceptance of the legal category of being able to marry. It's no small thing to say how amazing that change has been within my lifetime. As I mentioned before, this is a disease as people saw it in the 1970s, now being accepted as part of somebody's civil rights. And along those lines, homosexuality and anti-discrimination laws are still being contested. In 2019, the Supreme Court will decide if federal anti-discrimination laws prevent employers from firing workers because of their sexual orientation and gender identity. Deviance is in the eye of the beholder, and also what is considered deviant is open to change, and social movements can be a very important source of social changes.